The wind howled through the granite pass like a chorus of dying men, tearing at the canvas flaps of the overland stagecoach until they snapped like whips against the wooden frame. It was late November in the Wyoming Territory, the year of 1874, and the winter had come early, hard, and without mercy. The trail was a ribbon of treacherous ice carved into the side of the mountain, barely wide enough for the team of 6 horses that labored, heads down, against the blinding white gale. Inside the coach, the air was stale with the smell of damp wool, tobacco, and fear. A banker from St. Louis gripped the leather strap near the window, his knuckles white. A young mother held her infant tight against her breast, murmuring prayers that were swallowed by the roar of the storm. Across from them sat a woman in a dress of fine blue silk, hidden beneath a heavy traveling cloak. She stared at the floorboards, her mind thousands of miles away, detached from the peril rattling the carriage wheels. She did not speak. She had not spoken since the last station stop. Her eyes were red-rimmed, not from the cold, but from a grief that seemed to weigh more than the trunk strapped to the roof. The driver, a man named Jeb, who had driven these routes since the gold rush, cracked his whip, shouting to the lead horses. He could not see the loose shale shifting 300 feet above them. The mountain gave a groan, a deep, earthen rumble that vibrated through the chassis of the coach. It happened in a heartbeat. A boulder the size of a storefront window broke loose from the high ridge, bringing with it a cascade of stone and timber. The lead horse screamed as the ground beneath its hooves dissolved. The coach lurched violently to the left. There was the sickening sound of wood splintering, iron twisting, and then the world turned upside down. The stagecoach tumbled off the edge of the trail, rolling once, twice, 3 times down the steep, snow-choked ravine before crashing into a grove of ancient pines with a final, thunderous crunch. Silence followed, swift and terrible. The wind continued its mournful song, burying the wreckage under a fresh sheet of white. 2 days later, the silence of the valley was broken by the crunch of heavy boots on crusted snow. Elias Thorne moved through the drifts with the steady, plodding rhythm of a man who had long ago learned that fighting the mountain was a fool's errand. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broadened by years of felling timber and hauling stone. His coat was made of buffalo hide, thick and matted, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed a face that looked as if it had been carved from the very granite of the landscape. He led a pack mule laden with flour, coffee, and ammunition, returning from his monthly trek to the outpost. He stopped suddenly, his breath plumbing in the freezing air. The unnatural shape of a broken wheel jutted from the snowbank 50 yards down the slope. Elias tied the mule to a sapling and descended, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of the Colt Navy revolver at his hip. He had seen wrecks before. He knew what he would find. The smell reached him first, the metallic tang of blood frozen into the ice. The coach lay on its side, its frame shattered like a child's toy. The driver was gone, likely thrown during the descent. Elias moved to the cabin of the coach, prying open the twisted door with a grunt of exertion. The interior was a grim tableau. The banker lay at an impossible angle, his neck broken. The mother was curled over her child. Both were still, blue with the cold that had claimed them hours ago. Elias removed his hat, a brief, silent gesture of respect, before turning to leave. There was nothing to be done here but report the location when the thaw came. Then he heard it. It was a sound so faint it might have been the wind playing tricks on a lonely mind. A whimper. He froze, his eyes scanning the wreckage. He moved toward the front of the coach where the luggage boot had collapsed inward. Buried beneath a pile of splintered timber and a heavy leather trunk was a hand. It was small, pale, and wearing a glove of fine kid leather that had been shredded by the crash. Elias threw his weight against the debris. He heaved a heavy oak beam aside, ignoring the splinters tearing at his own gloves. Beneath the wreckage lay the woman in the blue dress. She was pinned, her legs trapped, her face a mask of dried blood and bruises. Her breathing was shallow, erratic, terrified little gasps that barely fogged the air. He knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands checking for a pulse at her throat. It was there, threading and weak. "You are alive," he thought, the surprise registering in his chest. Against all reason, you are alive. He worked with desperate efficiency. He used his hunting knife to cut away the straps of the trunk that crushed her lower body. He braced his back against the carriage frame and lifted the debris just enough to drag her free. She moaned, a sound of pure agony, but her eyes did not open. Elias gathered her into his arms. She felt terrifyingly light, like a bird hollowed out by winter. Her head lolled against his buffalo coat, staining the fur with fresh blood from a gash on her forehead. He carried her up the slope, his boots slipping on the shale, his lungs burning with the effort. He knew the odds. She had been out here for 2 nights. The cold had settled deep into her bones. He secured her onto the back of the mule, wrapping her in his own bedroll and lashing her tight so she would not fall. He took the lead rope and began to walk. His cabin was 5 miles away, across a ridge that the locals called the Devil's Spine. The weather turned as the sun began to dip behind the peaks. The sky bruised purple and gray, and the wind picked up, driving sleet into Elias's face. He pulled his scarf higher, leaning into the gale. He could not stop. To stop was to die. An hour into the trek, the mule spooked, jerking its head and braying loudly. Elias halted, his hand flying to his rifle. In the twilight, 3 pairs of yellow eyes reflected the last of the light. Timber wolves. They were gaunt, their ribs showing through their winter coats. Desperate with hunger, they circled, low to the ground, testing the man and the beast. One lunged at the mule's hindquarters. Elias did not hesitate. He fired a shot into the snow at the wolf's feet, the crack of the rifle echoing like a cannon shot in the valley. The wolf scrambled back, snarling. Elias pumped the lever and fired again, this time grazing the flank of the leader. "Get back!" he roared, his voice rough from disuse. It was a primal sound, matching the savagery of the landscape. The pack hesitated. They sensed that this prey would cost them too much. With low growls, they turned and vanished into the tree line. Elias soothed the trembling mule, his hand resting on the woman's motionless leg. "We are almost there," he muttered, though he was not sure if he was speaking to her or himself. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines that blocked the worst of the wind. It was a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney that promised warmth. Elias carried the woman inside, kicking the door shut against the swirling snow. The room was cold, but dry. He laid her on his narrow bunk, which was covered in furs. He moved quickly to the hearth, striking a match to the kindling he always kept ready. The fire caught, orange light spilling across the rough wooden floor. He turned back to her. He had to see the extent of the damage. With careful, almost reverent hands, he removed her ruined outer cloak. Her dress, once expensive and elegant, was torn and muddy. He hesitated, then used his knife to cut the fabric away from her injuries. Her left leg was purple and swollen, but not broken. Her ribs were bruised. The cut on her forehead was deep and ugly. He boiled snow in a cast-iron pot and tore up one of his clean flannel shirts to make bandages. He washed the blood from her face. Beneath the grime, she was striking, with high cheekbones and hair the color of spun gold, though now it was matted and dull. She remained unconscious for 3 days. Elias did not sleep. He sat in the rocking chair by the fire, his rifle across his lap, watching her chest rise and fall. He spooned broth made from dried venison and water between her lips, massaging her throat until she was swallowed by reflex. He kept the fire roaring, dragging the temperature of the small room up until sweat beaded on his own forehead. The isolation of the cabin was absolute. Outside, the blizzard raged, piling snow against the windows until the light was gray and dim even at noon. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the woman's labored breathing. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Elias was outside, chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing against the mountains. When he returned, carrying an armful of logs. He found her eyes open. They were blue, a pale, washed-out blue like the winter sky, and wide with terror. She had pushed herself up against the wall of the cabin, pulling the furs up to her chin. Her gaze darted around the room, the hanging dried herbs, the rifle on the rack, the stag head mounted above the door, before landing on him. Elias stopped in the doorway. He knew what he looked like to her. He was a giant in blood-stained buckskins, with a beard that hid half his face and a scar running from his temple to his jawline. He carefully set the wood down and held up his hands, palms open. "You are safe," he said. His voice was deep, gravelly, rusty like a hinge that had not been oiled in years. She flinched at the sound. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, raspy sound came out. She touched her throat, then her forehead, her fingers trembling. "Water," Elias said. He moved to the stove, pouring warm water into a tin cup. He approached the bed slowly, as one approached a frightened horse. She pressed herself harder against the logs, her eyes squeezed shut as if expecting a blow. "Drink," he ordered softly. She opened her eyes and took the cup, her hands shaking so badly the water splashed onto the furs. Elias reached out and steadied the cup, his large hand encompassing both of hers. She froze at his touch, but she drank. "Who are you?" she whispered. The words were fractured, weak. "Elias." He said, "I found you. In the past." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "The pass? The stagecoach? It went over." A flicker of pain crossed her face, sharp and sudden. She closed her eyes, rubbing her temples. I do not remember." "You do not remember the crash?" "I do not remember anything." She looked down at her hands, at the bandages on her wrists, at the strange room. Panic began to rise in her chest, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "My name," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "What is my name?" Elias watched her, his face impassive. There was no luggage, no identification, just the clothes she wore. "I do not know," he admitted. She let out a sob, a raw, jagged sound. She tried to move her legs to get out of the bed, but the pain in her injured limb forced her back with a cry. "Lie still," Elias said, stepping back to give her space. "You are hurt badly. You need to heal." He retreated to the far side of the room, occupying himself with cleaning his rifle. He kept his back to her, sensing that his gaze felt like a weight she could not bear. He listened to her weep, soft, muffled sounds into the pillow. It was a sound he knew well. It was the sound of someone who had lost the world. Days turned into a week. The routine was established in silence. Elias would wake before dawn, stoke the fire, and check the snares he had set in the woods. When he returned, he would place a bowl of porridge or stew on the small table beside the bed, then retreat outside or to the loft where he slept. He gave her privacy. When she needed to use the chamber pot, he would go stand in the snow, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, waiting for her signal, a knock on the window, before returning. He never touched her unless it was necessary to change a bandage, and even then, his touch was clinical, detached, though incredibly gentle for a man of his size. Clara, for that is the name she tried on in her mind, though she did not speak it yet, watched him. She was terrified of him, yet she depended on him for everything. She watched him move with a quiet grace that belied his bulk. She saw how he checked the temperature of the broth against his own wrist before giving it to her. She saw how he sat up at night when the wind howled particularly loud, his eyes fixed on the door, guarding her from the darkness. But the darkness was inside her, too. Sleep was not a refuge. It was a battlefield. Every time she closed her eyes, the fragments came, not of the crash, but of something else, something before. She saw a man's face, twisted in rage, red and sweating. She felt hands grabbing her shoulders, shaking her until her teeth rattled. "You are a burden," a voice hissed in the dark of her mind. "Ungrateful. Useless property." She saw a hand throwing a diamond ring. It hit her cheek, the metal stinging, before bouncing across a polished floor. She saw herself running, her breath burning in her lungs, running through rain-slicked streets, carrying nothing. She would wake screaming. One night, the scream tore from her throat before she was even awake. She sat bolt upright, gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Elias was there in an instant. He had been dozing in the chair. He knelt beside the bed, his face illuminated by the dying embers of the fire. "You are dreaming," he said. "It is not real." She looked at him, her eyes wild, not seeing him but seeing the phantom of her nightmare. She scrambled back, hitting the wall. "Do not touch me," she shrieked. "Do not touch me." Elias raised his hands, backing away slowly. "I am not him," he said quietly. "I am Elias. Look at me." She blinked, her chest heaving. The hallucination faded, replaced by the rough timber walls and the scarred face of the mountain man. She collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands, trembling violently. "I do not know who I am." She wept. "But I know I was running. I know I was afraid." Elias said nothing. He stood and walked to the stove, pouring a cup of coffee. He placed it on the table and sat back in his chair, keeping vigil. He wrestled with his own ghosts, watching her heal, watching her struggle to piece together a shattered mind, tore at scabs he had let harden over 10 years. He looked at her blonde hair, illuminated by the firelight, and he saw another face. Sarah. Sarah had not been in a stagecoach. She had been in a wagon, crossing the plains during the Great Migration of '65. Elias had been younger then, arrogant, sure of his ability to protect what was his. He had failed. A fever had taken her, swift and cruel, while they were miles from civilization. He had held her as she burned up, helpless, his strength useless against an invisible enemy. He had buried her on the prairie under a pile of stones to keep the coyotes away, and a part of him had gone into the ground with her. He had come to these mountains to die, or at least to forget. He had sought the silence, and now, this woman had brought the noise of life crashing back into his sanctuary. He resented her. He resented the fear in her eyes that mirrored his own guilt. He resented the way the smell of her hair, even unwashed and smoky, reminded him of a gentleness he had forsaken. And yet, he checked her bandages every 4 hours. He saved the best cuts of meat for her broth. He put an extra log on the fire even when the woodpile was running low. 2 nights later, the storm finally broke. The moon shone full and bright on the snow, casting a silver light through the frosted window pane. The cabin was silent. Clara was sitting up, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames. Her pain had dulled to a throbbing ache. Her mind was clearer, though the memories were still locked behind a heavy door. Elias was oiling his boots by the hearth. The rhythmic swish-swish of the rag was the only sound. "Why?" she asked suddenly. Elias stopped. He did not look up. "Why what? Why did you save me?" She turned to look at him. The firelight danced in her eyes, searching his face. "You could have left me," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You said everyone else was dead. You could have walked away. No one would have known. It would have been easier." Elias set the boot down. He stared at his hands, scarred and stained with oil. He thought of the cold wind on the prairie. He thought of the small mound of stones. He thought of the years of silence, the penance he paid in this frozen wilderness. He looked at her then. For the first time, he let the guard down behind his eyes. She saw a depth of sorrow there that took her breath away. It was a mirror to her own unseen wounds. He took a long time to answer. The logs shifted in the grate, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Because someone did not save her, he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. He stood up, taking the oil lamp, and climbed the ladder to the loft without looking back. Clara sat alone in the firelight, the words echoing in the silence. She touched the bandage on her forehead. She did not know who she was, or where she had come from. She did not know what monsters chased her in her sleep. But as she listened to the heavy, steady breathing of the man in the loft above, she knew one thing. She was alive. And for tonight, that was enough. The weeks that followed the fever were measured not in hours or days, but in the slow, agonizing inches of Clara's recovery. The cabin. once a terrifying prison of shadows and strangers, began to shrink into a known world. A small universe of rough-hewn timber and firelight that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. Clara learned the geography of the room by the ache in her leg. It was 10 steps from the bed to the hearth, a journey that initially left her breathless and trembling, beads of cold sweat standing out on her pale forehead. It was another 4 steps to the small table where Elias kept his tin plates and cups. For the first few days, she could only sit on the edge of the mattress, watching him. She watched him with the intensity of a scientist observing a dangerous, unknown animal. She learned the rhythm of his movements. He was a man of economy. He never took 2 steps when one would suffice, and he never spoke a word when a nod would do. He moved with a quiet heaviness, a grounded power that made the floorboards groan softly beneath his boots. By the second week, the shame of her helplessness began to outweigh the pain. When Elias went out to check the trap line, Clara forced herself up. She gripped the back of the heavy oak chair, her knuckles white, and dragged her injured leg forward. The pain was a sharp, hot wire running from her ankle to her hip, but she bit her lip until she tasted iron and kept moving. She made it to the stove. The fire was low, a bed of sullen red coals. She found the heavy iron poker and stirred the embers, adding kindling with shaking hands until the flames licked upward, bright and hungry. She found the coffee pot, cold from the morning, and set it on the cast iron surface. When Elias returned an hour later, carrying 2 skinned rabbits by their hind legs, the cabin was warm, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. He stopped in the doorway, the cold wind swirling around his legs. He looked at the fire, then at the coffee pot, and finally at Clara, who was sitting in the chair, exhausted but upright, her chin held high. He did not smile. Smiles were foreign currency in this high, lonely place. But he nodded. A single, sharp dip of the chin. "You should not be up," he said, "hanging the rabbits on a hook near the door. I am not an invalid," Clara replied. Her voice was stronger now, though it still cracked with fatigue. "I can be of use." Elias grunted, moving to the basin to wash the blood from his hands. "You need rest." "The bone is knitting. I need to move. If I stay in that bed another day, I shall go mad." He dried his hands on a rough towel and poured 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her. It was black, bitter, and strong enough to strip paint. But to Clara, it tasted like victory. From that day on, a tentative routine formed between them. Clara took over the small tasks. She peeled the potatoes he brought up from the root cellar, her delicate fingers looking absurdly out of place against the dirt-encrusted skins. She mended the tears in his shirts, though her needlework was finer and more delicate than the rough flannel required. As she worked, she observed him. She began to notice the map of violence written on his body. It happened on a Tuesday, when the light was flat and gray coming through the window. Elias had removed his heavy coat and the flannel shirt beneath to wash himself by the fire. He stood with his back to her, dipping a cloth into the basin of hot water. Clara froze, the potato peeler hovering in midair. His back was a tapestry of old pain. A long, jagged ridge of white scar tissue ran diagonally from his right shoulder blade down to his ribs. Smaller, circular scars, darker and puckered, dotted his lower back. Bullet wounds, or perhaps burns, and on his left arm, just above the elbow, was a brand, faded but legible, a cruel mark of ownership or punishment that had been seared into the skin. She must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, because Elias stiffened. He pulled the shirt back on quickly, his movements jerky and defensive. He turned to face her, his eyes hard, the walls slamming back up instantly. "What are you staring at?" he asked, his voice low and warning. Clara set the potato down. She did not look away. "Your back," she said quietly. "Those marks, they are not from the cold." Elias buttoned his shirt to the neck, his fingers fumbling slightly. "It is not polite to stare at a man's history." "Clara, that is not history," she said, her voice trembling. "That is torture." Who did that to you? He turned away, picking up the rifle and a rag, sitting heavily on the bench opposite her. He began to clean the weapon, the metallic clack-clack of the lever action filling the silence. "The world is a hard place," he said finally, not looking at her. "Men are hard creatures." "You are not like them," she ventured. Elias laughed, a dry, humorless sound that scraped against the air. "You do not know me. You know the man who pulled you out of a wreck. You do not know the man who put those scars there, or the man who earned them. Tell me." She challenged him. He stopped cleaning the gun. He looked at the fire, his eyes narrowing as if seeing something far beyond the flames. "I was a regulator," he said, "down in the Lincoln County Range Wars. 5 years back, hired gun. They paid us $20 a day and expenses to make sure the small ranchers knew their place." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty cabin. You killed people." "I did what I was paid to do," Elias said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It was a job. Until it wasn't." He looked down at his hands, turning them over to look at the palms. There was a family. Nesbitt was the name. They refused to sell their water rights. The boss told us to burn them out, said just to scare them. He paused, his jaw tightening until the muscle jumped. "Fire does not know how to just scare," he whispered. The wind shifted. The barn went up fast. The children were inside. Clara covered her mouth with her hand. "Oh, God! I tried to get them out," Elias said. "That is where the burns came from. But the smoke, it was too thick. I heard them screaming. I heard them stop screaming." He looked up at her then, his eyes bleak and haunted. "2 dark tunnels of despair. I put a bullet in the man who ordered the fire. And then I rode north until the snow was deep enough to bury the smell of burning timber. I have been here ever since." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Clara looked at the man sitting across from her. She saw the size of him, the violence capable in those hands. But she also saw the way he looked at the fire, as if he expected to see the ghosts of children in the flames. She stood up. Her leg protested, but she ignored it. She walked across the small space that separated them. Elias did not move. He sat frozen, waiting for her judgment, waiting for her to recoil in horror. Clara reached out. Her hand, pale and shaking, touched the scar on his cheek, the one that ran into his beard. Her skin was cool against his burning face. "I do not believe you are cruel," she whispered. Elias closed his eyes. He leaned into her touch for a fraction of a second, a microscopic surrender, before pulling back. "You should," he said roughly. He stood up and walked out into the snow, leaving her alone with the fire and the weight of his confession. Winter tightened its grip on the mountain. A blizzard rolled in from the north, a white wall of fury that buried the cabin up to the windowsills. For 6 days, they could not open the door. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the howling wind and the 4 walls of the cabin. The confinement forced a strange intimacy upon them. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. They moved around each other in a choreographed dance of avoidance and proximity. Elias, having run out of outdoor chores, turned to his small collection of books. They were old, water-damaged volumes he had traded for at the outpost. A collection of essays by Emerson, a torn copy of the Odyssey, and a Bible. He sat by the fire in the evenings, reading silently. Clara, bored and restless, asked him to read aloud one night. "My eyes are tired." She lied. The smoke stings them. Elias hesitated, then opened the Emerson. His voice was halting at first, unaccustomed to the rhythm of prose, but as he read, it smoothed out into a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in Clara's chest. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. He looked up. Clara was watching him, her chin resting on her knees. "Do you believe that?" she asked. Elias closed the book. "I believe the world tries to make us monsters. It is up to us to refuse." They talked late into the night. They talked about books, about the philosophy of solitude, about the nature of survival. Clara discovered that beneath the rough exterior, Elias possessed a sharp, curious mind that had been starved of conversation. And Elias discovered that Clara was not just a spoiled heiress. She was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a dry wit that surprised a laugh out of him more than once. It was during these long, fire-lit evenings that the flashes began. They came without warning, triggered by the smallest things: the smell of old paper, the sound of a log snapping in the fire. One evening, Clara was mending a tear in her blue dress, the one she had been wearing when he found her. She ran her thumb over the silk, feeling the texture. Suddenly, she was not in the cabin. She was standing in a shop, surrounded by bolts of suffocating velvet and satin. The air smelled of lavender water and stale cigar smoke. A man was standing behind her. She could not see his face, but she could see his hands, large, fleshy hands with manicured nails. They were gripping her shoulders, digging into the flesh. "Blue is too frivolous," the man's voice sneered. "You will wear gray. It befits a woman of your station. You are not a show pony. Clarissa, you are an investment. Clarissa." The name echoed in her mind like a gunshot. She gasped, dropping the dress. The cabin rushed back into focus. Elias was looking at her, concern etched on his face. "What is it?" he asked. "I remember," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I was in a shop. He was choosing my clothes, like I was a doll." "Who?" She shook her head, squeezing her eyes shut. "I cannot see his face, but I can feel his hands. They were cold. And he called me Clarissa." "Clarissa," Elias repeated. "It sounds like a name for a woman in silk." Clara hugged herself, rocking slightly. "We argued. I wanted the blue. He told me I was an investment." She looked up at Elias, her eyes swimming with tears. "He was not my husband, but he owned me. I can feel the ownership. It is a heavy thing. Elias, heavier than chains." "Then you were right to run," Elias said firmly. The flash continued. She saw herself running out of the shop, the bell above the door jingling frantically. She saw herself climbing into a carriage, weeping, clutching a carpet bag. She saw the driver looking back at her with pity. "I was going west," she said, the memory solidifying. "I had a cousin in San Francisco. I thought if I could just get far enough away. He could not find me." Elias reached out and placed his hand over hers. The contact was warm, grounding. "You are far enough," he said. "You are safe here." But the safety felt fragile. The storm outside raged on, rattling the door on its hinges, a reminder that violent forces were always waiting to break in. On the 5th night of the storm, the tension in the cabin shifted. It was no longer just the camaraderie of survival. It was something thicker, heavier, charged with an electricity that made the air hum. They were sitting on the rug before the hearth. The wind was shrieking like a banshee, shaking the sturdy logs. Clara flinched as a particularly violent gust slammed against the wall. She reached out instinctively, her hand finding Elias's forearm. His muscles were hard as iron beneath the flannel. He did not pull away this time. He froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He looked down at her hand, pale and small against his dark sleeve. Then he looked at her face. Her eyes were wide, searching for him. The firelight cast shadows that danced across her throat. In that moment, the distance between them, the miles of social standing, the years of tragedy, the walls of guilt, seemed to vanish. "Elias," she breathed. It was barely a whisper. He turned his arm, his hand capturing hers. His thumb traced the delicate bones of her wrist. He could feel her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird. He leaned in, drawn by a gravity he could not fight. He saw her lips part, saw the flush rise on her cheeks. Then he stopped. He saw the scar on his own hand, the white ridge of the burn. He saw the dirt under his fingernails. He saw the monster he believed himself to be. He released her hand abruptly, standing up and moving to the window, staring out into the blackness. "The storm is breaking," he said, his voice rough. "The wind is shifting." Clara remained on the rug, her hand still tingling where he had touched her. She watched his broad back, seeing the tension in his shoulders. She saw him take a deep, uneven breath, fighting for control. "Don't," she wanted to say. "Don't protect me from this." but she remained silent. That night, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. Clara was back in the carriage, but it wasn't moving. The door was ripped open. The faceless man was there. He reached in, his hands massive, blocking out the light. He grabbed her by the throat. "Did you think you could escape me?" he roared. "You belong to me." His thumbs pressed into her windpipe. She clawed at his hands, but they were made of stone. The air was cut off. Black spots danced in her vision. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was dying. She was dying in the dark. "No!" The scream ripped from her throat, shattering the silence of the cabin. She woke up thrashing, fighting invisible hands. She was tangled in the furs, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. "Clara, Clara, wake up!" Strong arms were around her, not the cold, crushing hands of her nightmare, but warm, solid arms. Elias pulled her against his chest, holding her tight to stop her flailing. "I've got you," he murmured into her hair. "I've got you. You're safe. Breathe. Just breathe." Clara clung to him, burying her face in his shirt. She could smell the wood smoke and the soap and the scent of him, musk and pine and man. She sobbed uncontrollably, her body shaking with the aftershocks of terror. "He found me," she choked out. "He found me. He is not here," Elias promised, rocking her gently. "It is just us, the snow, the mountain, and us. No one can find you here." He held her for a long time, stroking her hair with a clumsiness that was heartbreakingly tender. He hummed a low, tuneless melody, a vibration that traveled from his chest to hers. Slowly, the terror receded, replaced by a profound exhaustion and a new sensation, safety, absolute, unshakable safety. She fell asleep like that, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart. Elias did not move. He sat awake until dawn, watching the shadows retreat, vowing silently to kill any man who tried to put that fear in her eyes again. March arrived with a sudden, violent thaw. The sun came out, bright and piercing, turning the snowdrifts into rushing streams of meltwater. The sound of the wind was replaced by the constant dripping of water from the eaves and the roar of the river in the valley below. The world was opening up again. Elias stood on the porch, squinting against the glare. The pass would be clear in a few days. The road to the town of Bighorn would be passable. He went back inside. Clara was folding the blankets, her movements fluid and strong now. Her limp was barely a hesitation in her step. "The snow is melting," Elias said. Clara paused, clutching a quilt to her chest. "Yes, it is beautiful. I can take you down," he said. "In a few days, we can go to the sheriff in Bighorn. Send a telegram to San Francisco, or back east. Your family must be sick with worry." Clara turned to look at him. The color drained from her face. "No," she said. Elias frowned. "Clara, you have a life, a name, people who are looking for you, people who sold me," she corrected, her voice sharp. "People who looked the other way when I showed them the bruises. My parents, they only cared about the merger. The marriage was a business deal. If I go back, they will give me right back to him." She dropped the quilt and walked to him, her eyes blazing with a fierce light. "I am dead to them. The stagecoach crashed. Everyone died. Let Clarissa Monroe stay dead." Elias looked at her, conflict warring in his face. "You cannot stay here forever. Clara, this is a hard life. It is lonely. It is dangerous. I have never felt safer," she said. She reached up, her hand cupping his jaw. His beard was rough against her palm. She looked at the scars on his face, the map of his pain, and she saw only beauty. "You saved my life, Elias, but not just by pulling me out of the snow. You saved me by letting me be me. Just Clara. Not an investment, not a burden, just a woman." She stood on her tiptoes. He did not pull away. He stood rooted to the spot, his breath suspended. She pressed her lips to his cheek, just above the beard line. It was a chaste kiss, soft and fleeting, but it struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. It burned his skin. She pulled back, looking deep into his eyes. "Maybe I was not unlucky," she whispered. Maybe the crash was not a tragedy. Maybe I was meant to end up here. Elias looked at her, at the woman who had invaded his solitude and broken open his heart. He wanted to tell her she was wrong. He wanted to tell her he was a broken man with nothing to offer but a cold cabin and a gun. But looking into her blue eyes, clear and determined, he could not lie. Maybe, he rasped. Outside, the snow continued to melt, washing away the past, leaving the earth raw and ready for whatever would grow next. Spring arrived in the Wyoming high country not with a gentle whisper, but with the roar of breaking ice. The silence that had entombed the cabin for months was replaced by the rushing music of the creek, swollen with meltwater, and the wind no longer screamed. It sang through the pines, smelling of damp earth and pine resin. Elias stood by the corral, cinching the saddle on his roan mare. He looked different in the morning light, less like a phantom of the winter and more like a man who had remembered the feeling of the sun on his back. He turned as Clara emerged from the cabin. She wore the blue dress, cleaned and mended, though the hem was stained with mud and the silk was worn thin over it. She wore a heavy woolen shawl he had fashioned from an old blanket. Her hair, no longer matted, was braided back, shining like spun gold against the rough timber of the doorframe. "Ready?" Elias asked, his voice deep and steady. Clara nodded, a nervous smile playing on her lips. "I believe so, though I am not sure the horse will agree." Elias chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. It was a sound Clara had only heard once or twice, and it still startled her with its warmth. He offered his hand, a massive, calloused thing that engulfed hers completely, and helped her mount. He swung up behind her, his chest pressing against her back, his arms encircling her to hold the reins. They rode up the trail, higher into the peaks, where the air was thin and sharp as broken glass. They reached a mountain lake, a sheet of turquoise glass nestled in a bowl of granite, reflecting the jagged teeth of the Tetons. It was a place of startling beauty, untouched and wild. Elias dismounted and helped her down. He did not let her go immediately, his hands lingering on her waist for a fraction of a second before he stepped back to unhook the rifle scabbard. "Today," he said, handing her the heavy Winchester repeater, "you learn to feed yourself, and you learn to defend yourself." Clara took the rifle. It was heavier than she expected, the wood stock smooth and cool against her cheek. Elias stood behind her, adjusting her stance. He touched her shoulder, her elbow, guiding her body into alignment. His proximity was distracting, a heat radiating through her layers of wool. "Keep your eyes open," he instructed softly, his breath stirring the loose strands of hair at her temple. "Do not jerk the trigger. Squeeze it, like you are shaking a hand you do not want to let go of." Clara took a breath, steadied the sights on a dead stump across the clearing, and squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the crack echoing off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. Splinters of wood exploded from the stump. "I hit it," she cried, turning to him, her face flushed with adrenaline and delight. Elias was grinning. "That you did. Dead center." They spent the afternoon there. He taught her how to bait a hook with grubs dug from the wet earth, and how to cast a line into the deep, cold water. When she pulled out a flopping trout, squealing as it slapped against the grass, Elias threw his head back and laughed. It was a full, unrestrained sound that seemed to crack the last of the winter ice around his heart. Clara laughed with him, a bright, bell-like sound that felt foreign in her own throat. She had not laughed since before the engagement, since before the ring was shoved onto her finger like a manacle. The weather turned as they were packing to leave. The blue sky was swallowed by a swift, bruising darkness rolling over the peaks. The temperature plummeted. "We need to move," Elias said, scanning the ridge. "A storm is coming. Fast." They mounted the horse, but the clouds broke before they could reach the trail. The rain did not fall. It drove sideways, icy sheets of water that soaked them to the skin in seconds. Lightning tore the sky open, followed by thunder that shook the ground beneath the mare's hooves. Elias steered the horse off the path, guiding it toward a cluster of boulders at the base of a cliff. There was a shallow overhang, a natural cave carved by wind and time. He pulled Clara down from the saddle and dragged her into the shelter just as the heavens fully opened. The space was small, barely high enough to stand in, smelling of dry dust and old stone. Outside, the world had vanished behind a curtain of gray water. They were safe from the wind, but they were drenched. Clara's teeth began to chatter violently, the cold seeping into her bones. Elias looked at her, his face grim. "You are shaking. I am freezing," she stammered, wrapping her arms around herself. "We cannot build a fire here," he said, his voice urgent. "There is no dry wood, and in wet clothes, the cold will take you before the rain stops." He hesitated, looking at her with a dark intensity. "We need to get these wet things off, and we need to share heat. It is the only way." Clara looked at him. The socialite she had been 6 months ago would have fainted at the suggestion. But that woman was dead, buried under the snow in the wreck. The woman standing here was a survivor. "Turn around," she said, her voice trembling not just from the cold. Elias turned his back. He stripped off his heavy coat, his sodden flannel shirt, and his undershirt, leaving his chest bare to the damp air. His skin was a map of scars and muscle, bronzed by the sun and battered by life. Clara's fingers were clumsy with cold as she unbuttoned the blue dress. She let it fall to the dusty floor in a wet heap. She removed her petticoats, shivering violently as the air hit her skin, leaving herself in her thin chemise and drawers. "All right," she whispered. Elias turned. His eyes went to her, traveling from her bare shoulders to the curve of her waist, visible through the thin cotton. He swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He sat on the dry earth, his back against the stone wall, and opened his arms. "Come here." Clara went to him. She sat between his legs, leaning her back against his bare chest. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him. His skin was burning hot, a furnace against her chilled flesh. He rubbed her arms briskly, trying to generate friction, trying to drive the cold away. "Better?" he asked, his voice rough near her ear. "Yes," she breathed. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the rain hammer against the rocks. The shivering stopped, replaced by a different kind of heat. Clara could feel the steady, heavy beat of his heart against her back. She could feel the rise and fall of his chest. Every place their skin touched seemed to spark with electricity. She shifted slightly, turning her head to look at him. Their faces were inches apart. The storm outside felt 1,000,000 miles away. The only storm that mattered was the one rising in the small, dry space between them. Elias looked at her mouth. His eyes were dark, dilated, filled with a hunger he had denied for a decade. "Clara," he warned, his voice a low growl. "Do not look at me like that." "Like what?" she whispered. "Like you want me to forget who I am? Like you want me to forget that I'm a man with nothing to give you but hardship?" "I do not care what you have," Clara said, turning fully in his arms so she was straddling his lap, her hands resting on his broad shoulders. "I care who you are." She leaned in. He did not move. She pressed her lips to his. It was not the chaste kiss of the cabin. It was a collision. Elias groaned, a sound of surrender, and his arms tightened around her, crushing her to him. His mouth opened against hers, hot and demanding, tasting of rain and desperation. His hands moved over her back, tangled in her wet hair, pulling her closer as if he could merge her body with his. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the sensation of his rough hands on her skin and the taste of him. Then, Elias pulled back. He gripped her shoulders, pushing her away gently but firmly. His chest was heaving, his eyes squeezed shut. "No," he rasped. "No, I cannot do this." Clara froze. "Why?" "Because you are vulnerable," he said, opening his eyes. They were full of anguish. "You are grateful. You are confused. I will not take advantage of that. I will not be another man who takes from you just because he can." Clara looked at him, at the nobility warring with the desire in his face. She saw the fear in him, the fear that his touch would corrupt her, that his violence would taint her. She reached up, framing his face with her hands. She forced him to look at her. "You are not talking." "Elias, I am giving." She leaned her forehead against his. "Do not protect me from wanting you," she whispered fiercely. "I have spent my whole life being protected, and it nearly killed me. Let me choose. I choose this. I choose you." Elias let out a long, shuddering breath. The last wall crumbled. He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. The rain stopped as evening fell, leaving the world dripping and silent. They rode back to the cabin under a sky bruised purple and indigo. They did not speak, but the air between them was charged, a taut wire humming with anticipation. Inside the cabin, Elias built the fire up until the room was bathed in a golden glow. He turned to Clara. She was standing by the bed, watching him. The fear that had defined her first weeks here was gone, replaced by a shy, resolute courage. He walked to her slowly. He reached out and undone the braid in her hair, letting the gold waves fall over her shoulders. He touched her face with a reverence that made her throat tight. "You are beautiful," he said, the words sounding rusty but true. He undressed her slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He treated her body not as property to be inspected, but as a revelation. When he laid her back on the furs, his weight settling over her, Clara braced herself for the roughness she had been taught to expect from men, the entitlement she had seen in her fiancé's eyes. It never came. Elias made love to her with a slow, agonizing tenderness. He watched her face, tracking every emotion, pausing when she gasped, moving only when she pulled him closer. His hands worshipped her. He kissed the scar on her forehead, the bruises that were fading from her ribs. He murmured her name against her skin like a prayer. It was intense, raw, and overwhelming. When the crest came, it broke over Clara like a tidal wave, shattering the last of her defenses. Afterward, she lay curled against his side, the firelight playing over their tangled limbs. Tears began to slide silently down her cheeks. Elias felt the dampness on his shoulder. He propped himself up on one elbow, concerned about flooding his face. "Did I hurt you?" he asked urgently. "Clara, tell me." She shook her head, wiping her eyes. No, Elias, you did not hurt me." "Then why do you weep?" "Because I did not know." She sobbed softly. "I did not know it could be like this. I thought it was just a duty, a price women paid for security." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his rugged face. "He treated me like a broodmare. Elias." He checked my teeth. He discussed my hips with his father as if I were not in the room. He made me feel small. You make me feel vast." Elias stroked her hair, his expression somber. "You deserve tenderness. Clara, not ownership. Love is not a cage. It is a shelter." "I remember now," she said, her voice steadying. "I remember the night I left. We were at a dinner party. He grabbed my wrist because I laughed too loud. He squeezed it until a bruise formed. He leaned close and whispered that once we were married, he would teach me silence." She shuddered. "That was when I knew. I would rather die in the snow than live in his silence. So I ran." Elias kissed her forehead. "You are not running anymore. You are here." They fell asleep entangled, the boundaries between them erased. The days that followed were a golden haze. They worked the land together as the spring took hold. Clara learned to chop kindling, her hands growing calloused but strong. She wore Elias's spare shirts, cinched at the waist with a rope, her hair loose and wild. He called her Clara now. The name sounded right on his tongue, stripped of the formality of Miss or Ma'am. It sounded like she belonged to the land, and to him. They spoke of the future cautiously. Elias talked of expanding the garden, of perhaps trading furs for a milk cow in the autumn. He did not talk of her leaving. She did not talk of going. They built a fragile paradise in the shadow of the mountains, ignoring the world that lay beyond the pass. But the world has a way of finding those who wish to remain lost. It was 2 weeks later when the dog Elias kept, a half-wild stray that usually slept under the porch, began to bark. It was a low, aggressive bark that signaled a stranger. Elias was chopping wood by the barn. He stopped, the axe resting in his hand. Clara was on the porch, churning butter in an old wooden churn. She froze, her eyes meeting him. A rider was coming up the trail. He was a man in a long dust coat, riding a tall black gelding. He wore a flat-brimmed hat and carried a repeater rifle in a saddle holster. A tin star glinted dully on his vest, half hidden by the coat. Elias leaned the axe against the chopping block and walked to the porch. "Go inside," he said to Clara, his voice low and hard. "Stay away from the window." Clara retreated into the shadows of the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed the door frame, listening. The rider pulled up 10 yards from the porch. He did not smile. He had the cold, appraising eyes of a man who hunted men for money. "Morning," the rider said. His voice was dry as dust. "In the morning," Elias replied. He did not invite the man down. "Name Silas Vane," the rider said, resting his hands on the pommel of his saddle. "Bounty agent out of Denver." "I'm looking for a woman." Elias kept his face impassive. "Not many women up this high, just wind and rock." Vane reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He shook it open. It was a wanted poster, even from the doorway. Clara could see the bold block letters at the top. "This isn't a usual case," Vane said. "Clarissa Monroe, daughter of Archibald Monroe, the rail baron. Disappeared from a stagecoach wreck 3 months back. The family says she was kidnapped." "Kidnapped?" Elias said, his voice flat. "The wreck was an accident. Everyone died. That's what the report said." Vane agreed. "But the old man, Monroe, doesn't accept that. He hired me to track the wreckage. I found this site, found the graves, but I didn't find the girl's body. And I found boot prints. Large ones, carrying a heavy load away from the crash." Vane's eyes drifted to Elias's boots. Then they moved to the cabin door. "Monroe is offering $5,000 for her return," Vane said, "and another 1,000 for the head of the man who took her. He says she was taken against her will. Says she was delirious, injured. She was dying," Elias said, the anger slipping into his tone before he could stop it. Vane smiled, a thin, predatory stretching of lips. "So you did find her." "I found a survivor," Elias corrected, his hand drifting inches from the colt on his hip. "I saved her life." "She is free to go where she pleases." "Is she?" Vane asked. "Or is she a confused girl being held by a hermit with a reputation for violence? I asked around in town. Thorne, they know you. They say you're a killer. I am no kidnapper." "Then bring her out. Let me ask her, if she tells me she is here by choice." "I'll ride on." Elias hesitated. He knew what Clara looked like. She looked wild, dressed in his clothes, living in a shack. To a civilized eye, it would look exactly like captivity. Before he could speak, a floorboard creaked behind him. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She intended to tell the man to leave. She intended to say she was Clarissa Monroe and she was staying. But as she stepped into the light, she saw the poster in Vane's hand. She saw the drawing of her face, her high society face, framed in lace. And she saw the way Vane looked at her. He did not look at her like a person. He looked at her like a paycheck. And behind that greed, she saw the shadow of her father, Archibald Monroe, a man who crushed competitors and strikes with equal brutality, a man who would burn this mountain to the ground to get his property back. Panic, cold and irrational, seized her throat. She made a small, strangled sound and took a step back, her hand going to her mouth. The fear on her face was damning. "Well now," Vane said softly, "you don't look like a happy house guest. Miss Monroe, you look terrified." Clara stammered. "She is afraid of you," Elias growled. Stepping between them, Vane tipped his hat. "I'm sure she is." "Stockholder syndrome, they call it, or maybe just fear of the man holding the gun." Vane wheeled his horse around. "I've seen enough. You're a hard man to take alone. Thorne. But I won't be alone next time. I'll be back with the sheriff and a posse. You hold tight. Miss Monroe. Help is coming." He spurred the black horse and galloped down the trail, disappearing into the trees. Elias stood watching the dust settle. The silence he had cherished for so long was shattered, replaced by the ticking clock of approaching violence. He turned to Clara. His face was dark, his jaw set in granite. "Kidnapped," he said. The word was a curse. "You didn't tell me. I didn't know," Clara cried, rushing to him. "I didn't know they would say that. You didn't tell me your father was Archibald Monroe." Elias shouted. The volume of his voice made her flinch. "That man owns the judges. He owns the governor. He doesn't just have money. Clara, he has power. The kind of power that hangs men like me without a trial." I was ashamed. Clara wept, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted to forget him. I didn't want you to know where I came from. I thought if you knew I was a Monroe, you would hate me. You hate the rich. You hate the ones who take—" "I hate liars," Elias roared. He paced across the yard, running a hand through his hair. $5,000. Every gun hand in the territory will be looking for us by sunset. He stopped and looked at her. The tenderness of the night before was gone, replaced by the hard, cold look of a soldier under siege. "He thinks I took you. He thinks I am hurting you." Clara grabbed his arm. "We can explain. I will tell them the truth." "The truth?" Elias laughed bitterly. "Look at you, Clara. You are wearing rags. You are living in a shack with a known killer, and your father is the richest man in the West. Who do you think they will believe? The poor girl driven mad by trauma, or the father who wants to save her?" He pulled his arm away from her grasp. "He won't listen. He will hang me, and he will drag you back to that cage you ran from." Clara stood trembling in the yard. She felt the weight of her past crushing down on the fragile life she had built. She had tried to outrun her name, but it had caught up to her, and now it threatened to destroy the only man who had ever really seen her. Elias walked past her, heading for the cabin. "Get inside," he said coldly. "Pack what you can carry. We cannot be here when they come back." Clara watched him go. A low rumble of thunder rolled down from the peaks, vibrating in the ground beneath her feet. The spring storms were beginning. The sky to the west was turning black, the color of a bruise, heavy with rain and ruin. The interior of the cabin, once a sanctuary of warm firelight and quiet healing, had transformed into a frantic staging ground for flight. Elias moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, sweeping items off shelves and shoving them into worn leather saddlebags. Tins of coffee, a box of cartridges, a bag of dried venison. He packed them not with the care of a man preparing for a journey, but with the ruthlessness of a man burning a bridge. Clara stood by the hearth, her hands gripping the back of the rough-hewn chair until her knuckles turned white. She watched him, her chest heaving with a mixture of fear and a rising, volatile anger. He was shutting her out. The walls he had lowered over the last few months were slamming back into place, brick by mortarless brick. "You are moving too slow," Elias said, his voice flat and hard. He did not look at her. He was buckling a strap on the canvas bedroll. "Put your boots on, Clara, and the coat. It will be cold where we are going." "Where are we going?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking. "I am taking you to the ridge," he said. "There is a pass that leads down the eastern slope. It connects to the miners' road. You can walk to the settlement from there. It is safe. You will be found by decent folk, not vain." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "You are sending me away. I am saving your life," Elias snapped. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were cold. "Dead things. That man, Vane, will bring a war here. I can fight a man. I cannot fight the government. I cannot fight your father's money." "I do not care about the money," Clara cried, stepping toward him. "You should," Elias roared. He threw the saddlebag onto the table, the heavy thud echoing in the small room. "You are a Monroe. You belong in a world of gaslights and paved streets. You do not belong in a dirt floor shack with a wanted killer. I let myself forget that. I was a fool." He turned his back on her, reaching for his rifle. Clara moved faster than she ever had in her life. She crossed the room and grabbed his arm, spinning him around. The contact startled him. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up to her face. Her blue eyes were blazing with a ferocity that matched his own. "Do not you dare decide where I belong. she hissed. Elias tried to pull away, but she held on. "You think you are doing the noble thing," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "You think you are saving the damsel from the dragon, but you are throwing me back into the fire. I am sending you home," Elias said through gritted teeth. "That is not a home," Clara screamed. The sound tore at her throat. "It is a cage." She let go of him, backing away, her hands flying up to gesture wildly. "You think because there is velvet on the walls that it is soft? You think because the chains are gold that they do not cut? You saw the bruises on my arms, Elias. You saw the terror in my eyes when I first woke up." That did not come from the crash. That came from them. She took a breath, the tears finally spilling over. Hot and fast. "They'll lock me up in silk again," she choked out. "They will parade me around ballrooms and sell me to the highest bidder and tell me I should be grateful for the suffocation. You don't know how that feels. You don't know what it is to scream and have no one hear you because you are smiling the way you were taught." Elias stared at her. The anger in his face began to fracture, revealing the agony beneath. "I know what it is to be trapped," he said quietly. "No, you know exile," Clara countered. "You know loneliness, but you chose this. You chose the mountain. I had no choice, until now, until you—" She stepped closer again, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "If you send me back, you are not saving me. You are killing me. I would rather die on this mountain with you than live one more day in that house." Elias looked at her, really looked at her, stripping away the image of the heiress and seeing the woman who had learned to shoot, who had skinned rabbits, who had held him through the night. He closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. "I am a murderer." "Clara," he said. The words were heavy, leaden. "I know," she said. "You told me. The range war." "No," he interrupted. "Not the war. In the war. It was combat. Men facing men." He opened his eyes. They were dark tunnels to a past he rarely visited. "My sister," he began, the words dragging out of him. "Her name was Mary. She married a man named Silas, a good man. Everyone said a deacon, a pillar of the community." Elias walked to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "For 5 years, he beat her. He broke her fingers and told the doctor she fell. He blacked her eyes and told the neighbors she was clumsy. I did not know. I was away, driving cattle. When I came back—" He paused, his hand clenching into a fist on the windowsill. "I found her in the barn. She was hiding in the hayloft, too terrified to come down. She had lost the baby because he kicked her in the stomach." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I did not yell," Elias continued, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I did not challenge him to a duel. I walked into the house. He was eating supper. He looked up at me and started to say grace." Elias turned back to Clara. "I shot him in the chest. He fell onto the table. Then I shot him again, in cold blood. I killed him while he had a fork in his hand." The silence in the cabin was absolute. The fire crackled, a sharp popping sound that made them both flinch. "I kissed Mary on the forehead," Elias said softly. "I put her on a train to St. Louis with all the money I had. And then I rode into the Badlands. That is who I am. Clara, I am not a hero. I am a man who solves problems with a gun. And if you stay with me, that violence will touch you." "It already has." Clara looked at the man standing before her. She saw the monster he thought he was, but she also saw the brother who had destroyed his own soul to save his sister. She saw the protector. She walked across the room. She did not hesitate. She took his large, scarred hand in both of hers and pressed it against her heart. "Love means protecting someone no matter what it costs," she said firmly. "You protected her. You protected the memory of your wife." She looked up into his eyes, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Then protect me now," she whispered. "Do not send me back. Protect me." Elias looked down at her. He felt the rapid beat of her heart beneath his palm. He realized then that he had lost the argument the moment he pulled her from the wreckage. He was bound to her, not by duty, but by a gravity he could no longer defy. He nodded slowly. "Get the bedroll," he said, his voice rough. "We leave in 10 minutes." They moved with renewed purpose. The emotional storm had passed, leaving a clarity of action. Elias grabbed the Winchester and a box of shells. Clara tied her shawl tight around her shoulders and gathered the remaining food into a sack. They stepped out onto the porch, the air heavy with the scent of ozone and coming rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that vibrated in the floorboards. Elias moved to the hitching post where his mare and the pack mule waited. He helped Clara into the saddle. He was just putting his foot in the stirrup to swing up behind her when the crack of a rifle shot shattered the afternoon. Wood splintered on the porch post inches from Clara's head. "Get down!" Elias roared, dragging Clara from the saddle. He threw her to the ground behind the water trough just as a second shot kicked up the dirt where she had been standing. The horses screamed and reared, breaking their tethers and bolting toward the tree line. Elias rolled, coming up on one knee. The Winchester shouldered. Down the trail, 4 men emerged from the timber. Vane had returned, and he had brought the posse he promised. Hard men with dusters and grim faces. "Give it up, Thorne!" Vane shouted from behind a fallen log. "There is nowhere to go!" Elias did not answer with words. He fired. The lever action of his rifle was a blur of motion. Crack, clack, crack. One of the men, a deputy with a mustache, spun around, clutching his thigh, and went down, screaming. "Keep your head down!" Elias yelled to Clara. He shifted his aim, firing at Vane, forcing the bounty hunter to duck behind the log. The air was suddenly thick with the smell of black powder and the deafening roar of gunfire. Bullets thudded into the heavy logs of the cabin, sending showers of splinters raining down on them. Clara pressed herself into the dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw Elias moving, drawing their fire. He was calm, terrifyingly calm, returning fire with measured precision. Another man tried to flank them, running toward the barn. Elias tracked him, leading the target, and fired. The man stumbled, clutching his arm, dropping his pistol. 2 down. Elias grunted, ejecting a spent shell. But Vane was smart. He used the distraction to move up. He popped up from behind a boulder, his rifle leveling not at Elias, but at the water trough where Clara lay. Elias saw it. He did not think. He moved. He lunged across the open space, throwing his body between the gun and the woman. The shot hit him with a wet, sickening thud. Elias jerked back as if kicked by a mule. A bloom of red exploded on his left shoulder. He grunted, falling to his knees, the Winchester slipping from his numb fingers. "Elias!" Clara screamed. He crumpled to the dirt, clutching his shoulder, blood pouring between his fingers. Vane stood up, levering a fresh round into his chamber, a triumphant sneer on his face. He walked forward, taking his time. At the end of the road, "Thorne!" Vane called out. Clara looked at Elias, bleeding and gasping in the dirt. She looked at the rifle lying just out of his reach, and then she looked at Vane. Something inside her snapped. The fear that had ruled her life evaporated, replaced by a cold, white-hot rage. She lunged for the Winchester. Vane saw her movement and swung his rifle toward her, but he was too slow. Clara brought the heavy stock up to her shoulder, the way Elias had taught her. "Squeeze, don't pull." She did not hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard, bruising her shoulder. Vane's hat flew off his head as the bullet grazed his temple. He shouted in surprise, stumbling back, blood trickling into his eyes. He was not dead, but he was blinded and stunned. "Run!" Elias gasped, struggling to his feet. "Clara, run!" Clara pumped the lever, ejecting the shell, and fired again, wildly this time, just to keep their heads down. She grabbed Elias by his good arm, hauling him up. "The trail!" she shouted. "The hidden trail!" Elias leaned heavily on her, his face gray with shock. He stumbled, his legs threatening to give way. But Clara was there, a pillar of strength he had not known she possessed. She dragged him toward the dense brush behind the cabin, where the deer trail cut sharply up the cliff face. They scrambled up the rocky path, slipping on loose shale. Behind them, shouts and more gunfire echoed, but the shots went wide, biting into the trees. They climbed, lungs burning, legs screaming. Elias was dead weight now. his breathing ragged and wet. "Keep moving," Clara panted, half carrying him. Just a little further. They reached the tree line where the trail narrowed to a goat path along the sheer granite face. The wind here was ferocious, tearing at their clothes. The storm finally broke, rain lashing down in freezing sheets, washing the blood from Elias's arm as fast as it flowed. They moved like ghosts through the gray curtain of rain. Elias was fading, his steps stumbling and erratic. "Cave," he mumbled, pointing vaguely ahead. "Up, there." It was a fissure in the rock face, hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss and scrub pine. Clara shoved him through the opening and collapsed in after him. The cave was small, dry, and cold. Elias slid down the wall, leaving a smear of bright red blood on the stone. He groaned, his head lolling back. Clara scrambled to her knees. She was soaked, exhausted, and terrified, but her hands were steady. "Fire," she whispered to herself. "Need fire." She found the dry cache of wood Elias had told her about. He had stashed supplies in caves all over these mountains during his outlaw years. There was flint and steel and dry tinder. Her hands shook as she struck the flint. Once, twice, until a spark caught. She blew on it gently, feeding it dried pine needles until a small flame licked upward. The light revealed the extent of the damage. The bullet had passed through the meat of his shoulder. It had missed the artery, but he had lost a lot of blood. Clara took her knife, the small paring knife she had taken from the cabin, and cut away his sodden shirt. The wound was ugly, a dark, puckered hole oozing sluggishly. "I need to cauterize it," she said, her voice trembling. "Or bind it tight. Bind!" Elias rasped. His eyes were glassy, fever bright. "Too weak. For the fire." Clara tore strips from her petticoat, the white cotton stark against the gloom of the cave. She packed the wound tight, ignoring his hiss of pain. She wrapped the strips around his shoulder, pulling them tight, using her own leverage to stem the flow. He was burning up. The infection from the dirty bullet, or perhaps just the shock, was taking hold fast. He shivered violently, his teeth chattering. Clara stripped off her wet shawl and the outer dress, laying them near the fire to dry. She pulled the bedroll, which she had miraculously kept slung over her shoulder during the escape, and covered him. She lay down beside him, pressing her body against his, trying to transfer her warmth to him. "I am here," she whispered. "I am here." Night fell, absolute and suffocating. The storm raged outside, sealing them in the stone womb. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness. He muttered names Clara did not know. "Sarah, Mary." He apologized to ghosts. "I couldn't stop the fire," he mumbled, thrashing beneath the blanket. "The smoke, so thick." "Shh," Clara soothed, stroking his damp hair. "It is over. You are safe." Sometime past midnight, he went still. His breathing was shallow. Clara sat up, watching him. The fear that he might not wake up settled in her chest like a stone. She needed to tell him. If he died, she needed him to know. She reached into the saddlebag and found the small journal he kept. She tore out a page. She had no pencil, so she took a piece of charcoal from the fire's edge. She wrote quickly, the charcoal scratching against the paper. "My dearest Elias, if you are reading this, then I have failed to save you as you saved me. But know this, you did not die for a stranger. You died for the woman who loves you. You broke my cage. You gave me my name back. I will not return to them. I will live on this mountain, in the freedom you gave me, until the day I join you. Yours, always, Clara." She looked at the letter. It wasn't enough. She took the knife and sawed a lock of her golden hair. She found a dab of pine resin on a piece of firewood, melted it near the flame, and used it to stick the lock of hair to the paper. She folded it into a small square and tucked it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "If you die," she whispered to the sleeping man, "I will carry this to your grave myself, and I will plant wildflowers there." Elias stirred. His eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, hazy with fever. He looked at the ceiling of the cave, then rolled his head to look at her. "Clara," he croaked, "I am here. Elias, don't disappear." he murmured. His hand fumbled out from under the blanket, searching blindly. It felt like the snow was taking you. She caught his hand and held it to her cheek. I am not going anywhere. She wept, the tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. I promise you, I am staying right here. Why? He breathed, his eyes drifting shut again. Why stay? With a broken man? Because, she whispered, leaning down to kiss his fever-hot forehead. You are the only whole man I have ever known. Elias let out a sigh, his body relaxing as he slipped back into the dark. But this time, his hand stayed gripped in hers, an anchor in the storm. Clara watched the fire die down to embers, gun in her lap, keeping watch over the man who had taught her that love was not a chain, but a choice. The fever broke on the fourth night, retreating like a tide that had battered a shoreline into submission. Elias opened his eyes, and for the first time in days, the gray haze of delirium was gone, replaced by the sharp, dim reality of the stone ceiling. He tried to move, but his body felt as if it had been filled with lead shot. A sharp, tearing pain in his left shoulder reminded him of the bullet, but the throbbing heat of infection had dulled to a manageable ache. He turned his head. Clara was asleep sitting up, her back against the damp cave wall. Her head was tipped forward, chin on her chest, and her hands were resting on his good arm, as if holding him to the earth. In the faint light of the dying embers, he saw the dark circles under her eyes and the soot smudged across her cheekbones. She looked exhausted, thin, and ragged. She looked magnificent. He shifted, the gravel crunching beneath the bedroll. Clara woke instantly, her eyes snapping open, wide with the instinct of a sentry. She reached for the knife at her belt before she even registered who had moved. Elias, she breathed, the tension draining from her shoulders. You are awake. You are really awake. I am still here, he rasped. His throat felt like he had swallowed broken glass. Clara scrambled to her knees, reaching for the tin cup of water she kept near the fire. She supported his head, helping him drink. The water was cold and tasted of melted snow and pine needles, but it was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. She set the cup down and placed her hand on his forehead. Her palm was rougher now, calloused from the axe and the reins, but her touch was still the softest thing in his world. Cool, she whispered, a smile breaking across her face like dawn. The fever is gone. I thought the infection would take you. It takes more than a bounty hunter's bullet to kill a weed like me, Elias said weaky. He looked at the bandages on his shoulder. They were clean, stripped from the last of her petticoats. She had tended him while the storm raged outside, keeping the fire alive, keeping him alive, while he raved and burned. You saved me, he said. Clara looked down at her hands, the fingernails broken and dirty. You saved me first. It was only a debt repaid. It is not a debt, Elias said. He reached up with his right hand, capturing hers. He brought her knuckles to his lips, kissing the scars and the dirt, worshipping the strength in her fingers. It is not a ledger. Clara. She shuddered at the touch, a sound that was half sob, half sigh. She leaned down, resting her forehead against his chest, careful of the wound. I was so afraid. She confessed into his shirt, not of Vane, not of the dark. I was afraid of the silence that would come if you stopped breathing. They stayed in the cave for another week while Elias regained his strength. The food ran low, just a handful of dried jerky and the last of the coffee, but neither complained. Hunger was a constant companion, a dull ache in the belly that sharpened the mind. During the long hours of recovery, stripped of all pretense, they excavated the last ruins of their pasts. Clara sat by the fire one evening, twisting a loose thread on her hem. He hit me, she said suddenly. Elias stopped sharpening his knife. He did not look up, giving her the space to speak. It was 3 months before the wedding, she continued, her voice devoid of emotion. We were at the opera. I made a comment about the soprano. I said she sounded like a bird trapped in a chimney. It was a foolish thing to say, perhaps a bit loud. Richard, he gripped my arm. He smiled at the people around us, but his fingers were bruising my skin. She paused, staring into the flames. When we got into the carriage, he struck me, open hand, across the face. It split my lip. He told me I was embarrassing him. He told me I was an extension of his reputation, and if I could not be ornamental, I should be silent. Elias gripped the handle of the knife until his knuckles turned white. I told my father. Clara said, the next morning, I showed him the bruise. I told him I could not marry a man who hit me. What did he say? Elias asked, his voice a low rumble of thunder. He told me to put powder on it, Clara said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. He said Richard was a passionate man, under a great deal of stress. He said the merger of our railroad interests was worth more than a split lip. He said if I called off the engagement, I would be the one causing the scandal. I would be the one ruining the family name. She looked up at Elias, tears standing in her eyes. That was when I knew I was not a daughter to them. I was currency. So I planned. I stole money from my mother's vanity. I bought a ticket under a false name. I ran, and then the coach went over the edge. She wiped her face angrily. I tried to start over, she whispered. I tried to find a new life, but I failed. I am still just a runaway in a cave. Elias sheathed the knife. He moved with difficulty, shifting his weight until he was sitting beside her. He put his good arm around her shoulders, pulling her into him. You did not fail, he said firmly. Look at us. Elias, we are starving. You are shot. We are hunted. Look at you, he corrected. He turned her face toward him. The woman who left that carriage would have died in this cave 3 days ago. She would have frozen. She would have let the fire go out. You kept us alive. You fought a gunman. You dug a bullet out of my shoulder with a paring knife. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her eyes. That girl in the silk dress is dead. Clara, she died in the canyon. You are the woman who survived. You have already started over. You are just waiting for the rest of the world to notice. Clara looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. She found only the hard, unyielding truth of a man who did not know how to lie. A sob broke from her chest, and she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder. Elias held her, rocking her gently as the wind howled outside the cave mouth. The desire that rose between them then was not the tentative exploration of the first time. It was fierce and desperate, born of the knowledge that death had brushed them and moved on, but was still waiting in the shadows. Elias kissed her, tasting the salt of her tears. Clara clung to him, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, needing to feel the heat of his skin to prove he was real. They came together on the hard stone floor, wrapped in the buffalo robe, moving with a frantic urgency. There was no shyness now. There was only the raw, driving need to affirm life in the face of the void. When it was over, they lay tangled together, breathless and shivering as the fire burned low. Elias kissed the pulse point at her throat. We cannot stay here, he murmured against her skin. Vane will not stop. He will bring dogs next time. Where can we go? Clara asked. Sheridan. Elias said, it is a 3-day trek across the highlands. Hard country. But it is a railhead. There are judges there. Federal judges. What good is a judge against my father? A federal judge is appointed by Washington, not the territory. If we can get to Judge Holloway, he is a man of the law. If you stand before him, of your own free will, and declare your independence. If we file papers to change your name, legal papers, your father cannot claim you are kidnapped. He cannot claim you are a minor. We can disappear, Clara whispered. We can live, Elias said, in the open. But we have to get there first. They left the cave at dawn the next morning. The storm had passed, leaving the high country scoured clean and freezing. The wind on the plateau was relentless, a physical weight that pushed against them with every step. Elias was weak. The blood loss had sapped his stamina, and his shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. He leaned on a makeshift crutch he had fashioned from a pine branch. Clara walked beside him, carrying the rifle and the nearly empty saddlebag. The terrain was brutal. It was a landscape of jagged scree and wind-twisted scrub brush. There was no shelter. They slept that first night huddled in a shallow depression in the earth, sharing the single bedroll, shivering as the temperature plunged. "We have no food," Clara said on the second day. Her lips were cracked and blue. "Chew on this," Elias said, cutting a strip of leather from his belt. "It stops the cramping." They walked on. The wind bit through their clothes, seeking any weakness. Clara's boots, fine leather made for city streets, were disintegrating. The soles were thin, and the sharp rocks sliced through them. By noon of the second day, she was leaving small, bloody footprints in the dusting of snow. She did not complain. She set her jaw and kept walking, her eyes fixed on the horizon. In the late afternoon, they reached the gorge. It was a deep fissure in the earth, 100 feet deep, with a roaring whitewater river at the bottom. Spanning it was an old miner's bridge, a skeleton of rotting timber and fraying rope that swung ominously in the gale. "We have to cross," Elias said, shouting over the wind. "The trail picks up on the other side. It leads straight down to the valley." He looked at the bridge, then at Clara. "One at a time," he said. "I will go first. Test the wood." "No," Clara said, grabbing his arm. "If it breaks. If it breaks." "I fall," Elias said simply. "But you stay here." He stepped onto the swaying structure. The wood groaned, dry and brittle. He moved slowly, testing every plank, his knuckles white on the guide rope. The wind buffeted him, trying to knock him into the abyss. He made it to the center, the bridge bowing alarmingly under his weight. He reached the other side and turned, signaling her. "Keep your eyes on me," he shouted. "Do not look down." Clara stepped onto the bridge. It swung violently under her lighter weight, dancing in the wind. She gasped, freezing, her hands gripping the rough hemp rope. "Move! Clara!" Elias called his voice in anger. "Just look at me. Walk to me." She took a step, then another. The roar of the river below was deafening. A plank cracked beneath her foot, tumbling into the void. She screamed, losing her footing, swinging out over the gorge, holding on by just her hands. "Clara!" Elias dropped his crutch. He did not care about his shoulder. He ran back onto the bridge, the structure screaming in protest. He reached her just as her grip was slipping. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. He hauled her up, dragging her body over the edge of the planks. He pulled her into his arms, shielding her, and scrambled backward toward the solid ground. They collapsed on the far bank, gasping for air, the adrenaline coursing through them like fire. "You foolish man," Clara sobbed, hitting his chest weakly. "You could have died. You ran back out there. I told you." Elias wheezed, clutching his shoulder where the wound had torn open slightly. "I will protect you. That is the job." They rested for an hour, but they could not stop. The cold was settling in. Clara stood up to walk, but her legs buckled. She cried out as her ruined feet hit the rocks. Elias looked at her boots. The leather was gone at the toes. Her socks were soaked in blood. He stood up. He towered over her, swaying slightly, but his face was set in stone. He turned his back to her and knelt. "Get on," he said. "Elias, you are shot. You are bleeding. You cannot carry me. Get on, Clara, or I will drag you." She climbed onto his back. He grunted as he stood, the weight pulling at his injury. But he locked his knees and began to walk. For 3 miles, he carried her. Clara rested her head against his neck. She could feel the sweat soaking his shirt. Despite the freezing wind, she could feel the tremors in his muscles as he fought for every step. She listened to the ragged sound of his breathing, a harsh rasp that sounded like a saw cutting wood. He did not speak. He did not complain. He simply endured. Clara closed her eyes, tears leaking out to mix with the grime on his neck. She had been courted with sonnets and bouquets of hothouse roses. She had been given diamond earrings and promises of a grand tour of Europe. But no man had ever loved her enough to carry her across a mountain while he was bleeding to death. "This is love," she thought, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. It is not a feeling. It is an act of will. It is the refusal to let go. "I love you," she whispered into the wind. Elias did not answer, but his hand squeezed her calf, A silent acknowledgement. They reached the tree line as dusk fell. The lights of Sheridan twinkled in the valley below, a cluster of yellow stars gathering dark. Elias led her down gently. He leaned against a pine tree, his chest heaving, his face gray and drawn, but his eyes were triumphant. "We made it," he rasped. They waited until full dark to enter the town. They looked like specters, gaunt, filthy, their clothes in rags. Elias had smeared mud over his face to hide his distinctive scar, and Clara pulled the tattered shawl over her golden hair. Sheridan was a bustling hub of activity. The saloons were roaring with piano music and laughter. Miners and cattlemen walked the boardwalks. To Clara, after months of silence, the noise was deafening, almost aggressive. They stuck to the shadows of the alleys, moving like stray dogs. "We need a place to hide," Elias whispered. "Just for tonight." Somewhere Vane would not look. He led her to a small, neat house on the edge of town, away from the main thoroughfare. A light burned in the window. A sign swung above the gate. "Seamstress, laundry." Elias knocked on the back door. It opened a crack. A woman with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes peered out. She held a heavy iron skillet in her hand. "We have no money for beggars," she said sharply. "Mrs. Gable," Elias said, his voice low. "It is Elias. From the past." The woman's eyes widened. She opened the door wider, the light spilling onto their ruined forms. She looked at Elias's blood-soaked shoulder, then at Clara's bleeding feet. She did not ask questions. She did not scream. She stepped back and opened the door wide. "Get in here," she hissed. "Before the neighbors see you, Mrs." Gable was a widow whose husband had been killed in the same range war that Elias had fought in. Elias had once brought her venison when the winter was hard. She remembered debts. She heated water for baths. She bandaged Elias's shoulder with clean linen and poultice. She bathed Clara's feet in warm, salted water, clucking her tongue at the damage. "You two look like you crawled out of hell." "Mrs.," Gable said, pouring hot stew into bowls. "We are just passing through," Elias said. "We need to see Judge Halloway in the morning. Halloway's a good man." "Mrs." Gable nodded. "But the town is crawling with posters, bounty hunters everywhere. They are looking for a giant and a girl." Elias looked at Clara. She was eating the stew with trembling hands, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. "In the morning," Elias said. "I have one thing left to trade." He went out before dawn. Clara slept the sleep of the dead, safe in a feather bed for the first time in months. When she woke, the sun was high. Mrs. Gable was sitting in the rocking chair, mending Clara's torn shawl. "Where is he?" Clara asked, panic spiking instantly. "He will be back," Mrs. Gable said calmly. "Drink your tea." The door opened an hour later. Elias stepped in. He looked different. He had shaved his beard, leaving only a heavy mustache. He wore a clean, second-hand suit that was slightly too tight in the shoulders, and a bowler hat. He looked civilized, almost unrecognizable. He carried a package wrapped in brown paper. "Elias." Clara stared at him. "I sold the mare," he said quietly. Clara gasped. The roan mare was his most prized possession. His companion for 5 years. "Elias." "No, it was just a horse." "Clara." He walked to the bed and placed the package in her lap. "Open it." Clara untied the string. The paper fell away. Inside lay a dress. It was not the heavy, suffocating silk of her past. It was a simple calico, practical and sturdy, but it was a deep, vibrant blue, the color of the mountain sky, the color of the lake where they had fished. "I remember you said you liked blue," Elias said, looking at his boots. "And that man, he made you wear gray." He looked up at her, his eyes soft and vulnerable. "You are going to walk into that courthouse. Clara, you are going to stand before the judge. And you are going to do it as a free woman. You will walk into your future wearing color, not chains." Clara ran her hand over the fabric. It was rough cotton, not satin. It was the fabric of working women, of pioneer women. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She stood up, disregarding the pain in her feet. She walked to him and framed his clean-shaven face with her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "Get dressed," Elias said gently. "It is time to finish this." Clara dressed in the blue calico. It fit her loosely, hanging on her frame that had been thinned by hunger, but Mrs. Gable pinned it at the waist. Clara looked in the small mirror on the wall. She did not see Clarissa Monroe, the heiress. She saw a woman with sun-bleached hair, scars on her hands, and eyes that had seen death and survived it. She turned to Elias. "I am ready," she said. He offered her his arm. "If this goes wrong," he said, his voice low, "if the judge does not listen, I want you to run." "I am not running, Elias. We might not make it out of this town." Clara took his arm, leaning her weight against his solid warmth. She looked at the small room, at the widow watching them with tear-filled eyes, and then up at the man who had sold his horse to buy her dignity. "I never want to be found again," she said softly, "because I am already home." Elias covered her hand with his own. "Then let us go tell them," he said. They walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight of Sheridan, stepping off the porch and into the street, heading toward the courthouse where their fate waited. The town of Sheridan was a hive of agitation, buzzing with the dark energy that precedes a public violence. The rumors had started as whispers in the saloons, but had grown into a roar that echoed off the false fronts of the main street. The wanted posters were plastered on every available surface. The livery stable, the bank, the post office. The reward for the recovery of Clarissa Monroe and the capture of her abductor had been raised. It was now $10,000. It was a fortune that could change a man's life, or end it. The narrative spun by the wires from the East was simple and damning. A delicate heiress, the flower of New York society, had been dragged from a tragic wreck by a mountain savage. She was being held against her will, brainwashed and abused. The man, Elias Thorne, was painted not just as a kidnapper, but as a monster, a reclusive gunman with blood on his hands from the Lincoln County War. Elias and Clara, hidden in the back room of Mrs. Gable's small house, felt the walls closing in. The air in the town was thick with prejudice. Men who had never met Elias spat his name into the dirt. They did not see a man. They saw a devil who had touched an angel. "We need supplies before we see the judge," Elias said on the second morning. "My shoulder is stiffening. We need laudanum and clean bandages if we are to make a good impression." "I will go," Clara said, smoothing the blue calico dress. "No one looks at a woman in a simple dress. They are looking for a giant and a lady in silk." Elias hesitated, his instinct screaming against separation. But the logic was sound. He was the face on the poster. She was just a woman in blue. "Be quick," he warned, handing her a few coins Mrs. Gable had pressed on them. "Do not speak to anyone. Keep your head down." Clara walked out into the morning sun. The boardwalk was crowded. She pulled her shawl tight, weaving through the miners and cattlemen. She reached the apothecary without incident, purchasing the supplies with a lowered gaze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of fear. She was stepping back out onto the street when the shouting started. It came from the direction of Mrs. Gable's house. Clara froze. She saw a crowd running, dust kicking up in the street. She heard the smash of glass. She heard a voice she recognized, the sheriff, a man named Miller, whose voice carried the weight of authority and violence. "Bring him out!" Miller shouted. Clara dropped the package. She ran. She forgot the disguise, forgot the caution. She ran toward the house, her skirts kicking up the dust. When she arrived, the front door was shattered. 2 deputies were dragging Elias out onto the porch. He was fighting, but he was weakened by his wound and unarmed. Blood trickled from a fresh cut on his brow. A third man struck him in the kidneys with the butt of a rifle, bringing him to his knees. "Elias!" Clara screamed, trying to push through the growing mob. A hand grabbed her arm. It was not a helping hand. It was rough, calloused. "Got her!" a man shouted. "Here is the girl!" The crowd turned, hundreds of eyes fixed on her. They did not see Clara. They saw the victim, the prize, the excuse for their violence. "Let him go!" Clara cried, struggling against the grip. "He did not take me. I went with him. She is confused." Someone yelled, "He has turned her mind." Another shouted, Sheriff Miller stepped off the porch, looking down at Elias, who was kneeling in the dirt, breathing hard. The sheriff spat a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "Elias Thorne," the sheriff announced, his voice booming for the benefit of the crowd. "You are under arrest for the kidnapping of Clarissa Monroe and for the attempted murder of a bounty agent." "I did not kidnap her," Elias rasped. Looking up, his eyes searched the crowd until they found Clara. "We do not need a trial for a dog like this," a voice shouted from the back. "Hang him!" The chant took hold instantly, a terrifying, rhythmic stomp of boots on the packed earth. "Hang him! Hang him!" Sheriff Miller raised a hand. "We are civilized men," he declared, though his eyes were cold. "We will follow the law. We will hold him in jail tonight. The circuit judge is in town. We will hang him tomorrow at noon, legal and proper." They hauled Elias to his feet. He did not struggle. He looked at Clara, his gaze intense and pleading. "Go to the judge," he mouthed. Then they dragged him away, the mob following like a pack of wolves trailing a wounded elk. Clara stood alone in the street, the dust settling around her blue dress. "Mrs." Gable came out onto the porch, weeping, clutching her apron. "They will kill him. Mrs." Gable sobbed. "They do not want justice, child. They want a show." Clara looked at the empty street where Elias had been taken. The fear that had defined her life for so long, the fear of her father, the fear of the crash, the fear of the cold, evaporated. In its place, a cold, hard diamond of resolve formed in her chest. "Where does Judge Holloway live?" Clara asked. "Mrs." Gable pointed to a large, two-story brick house at the end of the street. Clara did not run. She walked. She walked with the stride of a woman who had crossed a gorge on a rotting bridge. She walked with the dignity of a queen going to war. She marched up the steps of the brick house and pounded on the door. A maid answered, looking startled at the disheveled woman with fierce eyes. "I must see Judge Holloway," Clara said. "The judge is at dinner. Miss, he cannot be disturbed. Tell him Clarissa Monroe is here," Clara said, pushing past the maid into the foyer. "And tell him if he does not see me, I will burn this house down around his ears." The judge appeared at the top of the stairs. He was an older man, with a mane of white hair and a face that looked like it had been etched from granite. He wore a dinner jacket and held a napkin in his hand. "That is a strong threat for a young woman," the judge said, descending the stairs slowly. "I am not a young woman," Judge Clara said, her voice steady. "I am a survivor, and you are about to hang the man who saved me." She reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, stained with soot and sealed with a lock of golden hair and pine resin. It was the letter she had written in the cave, the letter Elias had carried in his pocket, which she had retrieved while he slept at Mrs. Gable's. "Read this," she commanded, holding it out. The judge took the paper. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the charcoal scrawl. He looked at the lock of hair. He looked at the desperation and the love written in every line. He looked up at Clara. This was written in a cave? It was written when I thought he was dying. Clara said, "When I thought I would have to bury him." Does that read like the letter of a captive, judge, or does it read like the testament of a free woman? The judge folded the paper slowly. "The sheriff says you are deluded. He says you are suffering from hysteria. The sheriff is a fool who listens to bounty hunters." Clara snapped. "I am asking for a hearing. In open court. Before you pass a sentence, the hanging is set for noon." The judge said, "Then open your court at 9. Clara said, "Look me in the eye. Judge Holloway, hear my voice, and then tell me if I am mad." The judge studied her. He saw the steel in her spine. He saw the truth in her stance. 9 o'clock, he said. The courtroom was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and anticipation. Every seat was filled. Men stood lining the walls. The balcony was overflowing. Sheriff Miller sat at the front, looking smug. Vane, the bounty hunter, sat beside him, a bandage around his head, his eyes dark with malice. Elias sat at the defendant's table. He was in irons. His face was bruised, his lips split, but he sat upright, his shoulders squared. When he saw Clara enter, a flicker of light passed through his dark eyes. Clara walked down the center aisle. She wore a blue calico dress. Her hair was braided back simply. She held her head high, ignoring the murmurs and the catcalls. She took her seat beside Elias. She reached out and took his manacled hand in hers. The sheriff jumped up. "She cannot sit there. She is the victim. She is the witness," Judge Holloway barked, entering from his chambers. "Sit down, Sheriff." The judge took his seat behind the high wooden bench. He slammed his gavel down, the sound like a gunshot that silenced the room. "This is a hearing to determine the guilt of Elias Thorne," the judge announced, "and to determine the status of Miss Clarissa Monroe." He looked at Clara. "Stand up, Miss Monroe." Clara stood. She felt the weight of 500 pairs of eyes on her. "Tell us," the judge said, "were you taken against your will?" "No," Clara said clearly. Her voice rang out, reaching the back of the room. "I was saved. Tell us the truth." The judge commanded. Clara took a breath. She looked at Vane, then at the sheriff, and finally at the crowd. "The truth is that I was dead," she began. "I died in a carriage crash in the winter. The woman who lived in New York, the woman who wore silk and feared her own shadow, froze to death in the snow. The room was deadly silent. The man you call a monster pulled me from the wreckage," Clara continued. "He carried me 5 miles through a blizzard. He fed me when he had barely enough for himself. He gave me his bed while he slept on the floor. He never touched me. He never raised his voice. He healed me." She turned to look at Elias. "You say he is a savage because he lives on a mountain. But I lived among the civilized men of New York. My fiancé, a man of wealth and breeding, struck me across the face because I laughed too loudly. My father, a pillar of industry, told me to cover the bruises and smile because my marriage was a business merger." A gasp rippled through the room. "That is civilization," Clara said, her voice rising with passion. "A cage made of gold. A life where I was property. Elias Thorne did not kidnap me. He taught me how to build a fire. He taught me how to shoot. He taught me that I have hands and feet and a mind of my own. He taught me to want to live." She turned back to the judge. "I ran from my father. I ran from the abuse. If you hang this man, you are not saving me. You are murdering the only person who ever treated me like a human being." The judge leaned forward. His expression was unreadable. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, "stand up." Elias stood, the chains rattling. "You have heard the lady," the judge said. "She claims she is free, but the law says she is a minor in the care of her father. The law says you are a man with a violent past. Why should I not send her home?" Elias looked at the judge. Then he looked at Clara. "Because it would kill her," Elias said. His voice was deep, rough, and filled with a terrifying conviction. "I am a sinner. Judge," Elias continued, "I have killed men. I have done things that haunt my sleep. I am not a man for society. I belong in the wild. But this woman, she is the bravest soul I have ever met." He lifted his shackled hands, gesturing to Clara. "I tried to send her back. I tried to make her leave me. I told her she belonged in a palace, not a cave. But she told me that a palace can be a prison. I would die today, right now, on this floor, before I let you put her back in that cage." He looked at the sheriff. "Hang me if you must, but let her go. Let her be free. If you send her back to that man who sells her like cattle, then you are the criminals. Not me." The courtroom erupted. Men were shouting, some in anger, some in agreement. The sheriff was red-faced, banging his fist on the table. Judge Holloway hammered his gavel until the wood splintered. "Order. Order in this court." Silence fell again. Clara turned to Elias. She did not care about the crowd. She did not care about the judge. She stepped closer to him. She reached up, her hands cupping his bruised face. "I chose him," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She stood on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. It was a kiss of defiance, a kiss of ownership. It was a seal broken and a covenant made. The crowd stared, stunned. This was not the behavior of a victim. This was the act of a woman claiming her mate. She pulled back, breathless, her forehead resting against his. "I choose this life," she whispered. Judge Holloway sat back in his chair. He looked at the bounty hunter, Vane, who was scowling. He looked at the sheriff, who looked uncertain, and he looked at the couple standing in the sunbeam that fell through the high window. The law, the judge began slowly, is a rigid thing, but justice is a living thing. He picked up a pen and wrote something on the docket. The charge of kidnapping is dismissed. The judge ruled. The testimony of the alleged victim is clear. She was not taken. She went. "But she is a minor," Vane shouted, standing up. Her father is in New York," the judge cut in, "and in the Wyoming territory. A woman is considered of legal age to decide her fate if she can prove she is self-sufficient." The judge looked at Clara's hands, the calluses, the dirt, the strength. This woman survived a winter in the high peaks. She crossed the highlands on foot. "She is no child. I declare Clarissa Monroe to be of legal age and sound mind. She is free to go." "And the man?" the sheriff asked sullenly. "He shot a deputy. Self-defense," the judge said, staring at Vane. "Against an aggressive pursuit of a crime that did not exist." The judge stood up. "Elias Thorne, you are free to go. But I suggest you leave this town. Opinions are divided, and the law cannot stop a bullet in the back." Sheriff Miller unlocked the irons with trembling hands. The shackles fell to the floor with a heavy clang. Elias rubbed his wrists. He looked at the judge and nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. Then he took Clara's hand. They walked down the aisle. The crowd parted. Some men glared, their hands near their guns, but others, the miners who knew hard luck, the women who knew hard men, nodded. Some even took off their hats. They walked out of the courthouse, out of the shadow of the hanging tree, and into the blinding light of the afternoon. They did not stop at the hotel. They did not stop at the saloon. They walked straight to the edge of town, past the last fence post, past the last barking dog. They walked until the road turned into a trail, and the trail turned into open prairie. They did not buy land. They did not register a claim. They knew that paper meant nothing to people like Archibald Monroe. Safety lay in the silence of the deep wild. They walked west, toward the jagged silhouette of the Teton Range, purple and white against the setting sun. They walked away from the world of men, and back into the world they had made for themselves. Time moved differently in the high valley. It was measured in the turning of the leaves, the thickening of the deer's coat, the rising of the river. It was late autumn. A year later, the aspen trees were a riot of gold, shaking in the wind like coins. A small cabin sat near the bend of the river, sturdy and tight against the coming winter. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. Elias stood on the porch. He was older, the gray in his beard more pronounced, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes. His shoulder had healed, though it ached when the pressure dropped. He held a carving knife in his hand. He was working on the lintel of the door, carving deep, deliberate letters into the hard pine beam. CLARRA. The door opened. Clara stepped out. She moved slowly, her hand resting on the heavy swell of her belly beneath her wool dress. She carried a mug of steaming tea. She looked at the carving, tracing the letters with her finger. "You are marking your territory," she teased gently. "I am marking my home," Elias corrected. He sheathed the knife and turned to her. He wrapped his large arms around her from behind, his hands resting protectively over the life growing inside her. He rested his chin on the top of her head, smelling the lavender and wood smoke in her hair. The wind blew down from the pass, carrying the scent of snow. It was the same wind that had once tried to kill them, but now it felt like an old friend. Clara leaned back against him, closing her eyes. She thought of the stagecoach. She thought of the silk dress. She thought of the courtroom. It all seemed like a story from another life, a book she had read and closed long ago. "Elias," she said softly. Why me?" she asked. It was the question she had asked in the dark of the winter, when she was broken and bleeding. "Why did you save me?" Elias turned her around in his arms. He looked down at her face, which was fuller now, glowing with health and peace. He looked at the life they had created in the middle of the wilderness. He pulled her close, kissing her forehead, then her lips, and finally, he knelt down and kissed the swell of her belly. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with a fierce, unshakable love. "Because your journey ends with me," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "and mine began with you." The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, but in the cabin by the river, there was only light. Thank you for listening to the story of Clara and Elias. It has been a journey through the snow and the heart of the American West. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment telling me where you are listening from in the world. If you enjoyed this tale of survival and love, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories from the frontier. Share your thoughts in English in the comments below. I read every one of them. Until the next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.